Dr. Elias Blackwood was a brilliant yet deranged surgeon who worked at St. Dismas over 50 years ago. Obsessed with experimental procedures, he was eventually stripped of his medical license after multiple patient deaths under his care. Refusing to stop his work, he continued performing illegal surgeries in a secret operating room, until one night he vanished without a trace. Now those who spend the night at St. Dismas report chilling encounters, the clatter of surgical tools, the cold touch of unseen hands, and the silhouette of a doctor in a white coat, holding a gleaming scalpel. Once you're on Dr. Elias's operating table, you never leave alive. The first night at St. Dismas Hospital was eerily quiet. Daniel Carter lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of the overhead lights. His body ached from the car accident that had landed him here, but something else was bothering him, an uneasy feeling he couldn't shake. Earlier that evening, a nurse had said something strange. If anything feels off tonight, don't ignore it. Keep the lights on. Stay awake. At the time, he had laughed it off, assuming it was just a way to discourage deep sleep in case of complications. But now, alone in the dimly lit room, her words echoed ominously in his mind. A cold draft seeped in through the window. The digital clock on his bedside table glowed 2:13 a.m. Then he heard it. Click, click, click. The sound of metal instruments clinking together, like scalpels being arranged on a tray. Daniel held his breath. Maybe it was just a nurse prepping in another room. Maybe it was just the hospital settling. But the sound grew louder. Then footsteps. Soft. Deliberate. Right outside his curtain. A shadow passed along the thin fabric divider. A tall figure in a white coat. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. Then came the whisper. Right beside his ear. The next patient is ready. Daniel's entire body froze. The whisper had been so close, too close. His breath hitched in his throat as he stared at the thin hospital curtain. The shadow behind it stood still, unmoving. The fluorescent hallway lights barely outlined its figure, a tall man in a long white coat. A doctor. Daniel swallowed hard. He reached for the call button beside his bed, his fingers trembling as he pressed it over and over. The figure didn't move. The seconds stretched unbearably, each one slower than the last. Then, the curtain rustled. A cold hand gripped the edge of his bed railing. Daniel jerked back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The door burst open. "Mr. Carter?" A nurse rushed inside, her eyes filled with concern. The overhead lights flickered on, flooding the room with brightness. Daniel gasped, his gaze darting back toward the curtain. The figure was gone. Nothing but the sterile white fabric swayed slightly, as if someone had just been there. The nurse, a young woman with tired eyes and a ponytail, frowned. "Are you all right?" You pressed the call button multiple times. Daniel's mouth was dry. His heart still pounded, but now that the room was brightly lit, the terror from moments ago felt almost absurd. "Had he imagined it?" "Aye," his voice came out hoarse. "There was someone here." The nurse's brows furrowed. She glanced around the empty room, then back at him. "Are you sure? We don't have any doctors making rounds at this hour." Daniel hesitated. Tall. White coat. He was standing right there. He pointed at the curtain. The nurse pursed her lips. "I'll check the hallway." She stepped outside, peering in both directions before shaking her head. "There's no one here." Daniel rubbed his face, exhaling shakily. "I swear I saw someone." She gave him a small, knowing smile. St. Dismas is an old hospital. Sometimes people imagine things when they're on pain meds. He wanted to argue, but maybe she was right. He had been through a traumatic accident. His mind could just be playing tricks on him. Still, he had heard the whisper, felt the presence. Before she left, the nurse turned to him again. "Get some rest, Mr. Carter. But if anything else happens, call us." Daniel nodded weakly, though sleep was the last thing on his mind now. The next morning, Daniel was awoken by a sharp sting in his left arm. He groaned, wincing as he shifted slightly. His arm throbbed, like a fresh wound had been reopened. Confused, he slowly pulled back the hospital blanket and pushed up his sleeve. His breath caught in his throat. There, just above his elbow, was a thin, clean incision, like a surgical cut. The skin around it was tender and slightly reddened, as if it had been done recently. Daniel's stomach twisted. No, this wasn't there before. His heart pounded as he traced the wound with his fingers. It wasn't deep, but it was precise, not the kind of injury one would get from a simple scrape. A shiver crawled down his spine. Had he been operated on while he slept? Impossible. He would have woken up. He should have woken up. Daniel frantically checked his medical chart at the foot of his bed. His scheduled procedures hadn't changed. There was no record of any treatment during the night. Yet, someone had cut him open. His thoughts spiraled. Was this a mistake? A prank? Or had the doctor he saw last night done this to him? A sickening dread settled in his gut. He needed answers. And there was only one place to start. Daniel demanded to speak with the hospital director. An hour later, a well-dressed man in his 50s entered the room. His ID badge read, Dr. Henry Lawson, Chief of Medicine. I heard you had some concerns, Mr. Carter. Dr. Lawson's tone was calm but professional. Daniel wasted no time. Last night, I saw a doctor in my room. He was tall, wearing a white coat, but the nurse told me there were no rounds scheduled. Dr. Lawson's expression remained neutral. You must have been mistaken. Daniel tensed. I wasn't. I saw him standing behind the curtain. He whispered something to me. Dr. Lawson studied him carefully, then sighed. I understand that hospitals can feel unsettling at night, especially after an accident. It's not uncommon for patients to experience hallucinations or vivid dreams due to medication. Daniel gritted his teeth. Then explain this. He pulled up his sleeve, revealing the incision. Dr. Lawson's polite mask faltered. His gaze darkened, just for a second. He knew something. But just as quickly, he schooled his features and folded his hands. Are you sure you didn't scratch yourself in your sleep? Daniel clenched his jaw. That's not a scratch. It's a surgical cut. Dr. Lawson exhaled, placing the chart back at the foot of the bed. I assure you, Mr. Carter, no unauthorized procedures happen in this hospital. His tone was dismissive. Too dismissive. Daniel wasn't buying it. Someone or something had done this to him. And if the hospital wasn't going to give him answers, he would find them himself. Later that day, when his assigned nurse, Lisa, came in to check his vitals, Daniel decided to press her for information. Lisa, he said carefully, watching her reaction. Has anyone ever talked about seeing a doctor here at night? Lisa stiffened slightly before forcing a neutral expression. What do you mean? A doctor who isn't supposed to be here, Daniel clarified. One that just appears. Lisa hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. You should focus on your recovery, she said instead. Daniel narrowed his eyes. You know something? Lisa sighed, glancing at the door as if to make sure no one was listening. Then in a hushed voice she said, Patients have mentioned things before, seeing someone at night, but the hospital denies it. A chill ran through Daniel's spine. Who is he? Lisa swallowed. There's a name that some of the older nurses whisper about, but no one ever says it out loud. She looked around again, then lowered her voice even further. Dr. Elias Blackwood. Daniel's blood turned to ice. Lisa's eyes darted toward the hallway as she quickly packed up her medical supplies. Forget I said anything. Then she left, leaving Daniel with nothing but a name and a growing sense of terror. Lisa's words haunted Daniel long after she left. Dr. Elias Blackwood. The name carried weight, as if merely speaking it out loud could summon something terrible. Daniel needed answers. He couldn't just sit here, waiting for the next time that doctor, came for him. If no one at the hospital would talk, he'd have to find another way. And that meant digging into the past. By the afternoon, Daniel had managed to convince Lisa to help him, reluctantly. I shouldn't be doing this, she muttered as she led him in a wheelchair down the quiet hallways of St. Dismas. You don't have to, Daniel said. I can do it alone. Lisa exhaled sharply. And let you wander around while you're injured? No way. They stopped in front of an old wooden door marked Archives. Lisa glanced around nervously, then swiped her ID badge. The lock clicked open. The air inside was thick with dust, and the dim yellow lights flickered slightly. Rows upon rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, stretching back decades of hospital history. Daniel's pulse quickened. Somewhere in here, Dr. Elias's story waited to be uncovered. They sifted through old patient files and staff records, flipping through brittle pages that smelled of time and decay. Then Lisa froze. Here, she whispered, sliding a yellowed newspaper article in front of Daniel. It was dated April 3, 1972. The headline sent a shiver down his spine. Renowned surgeon disappears amid scandal. Dr. Elias Blackwood missing after illegal surgeries exposed. Daniel's hands tightened around the paper as he read. Dr. Elias Blackwood had been one of the hospital's most brilliant surgeons, but his methods were questionable at best, horrifying at worst. Rumors spread that he performed unapproved experimental surgeries on patients without their consent. Some lived. Many did not. When the hospital finally tried to fire him, Elias refused to leave. Then one night, he vanished. His private operating room was found abandoned, with bloody surgical tools still laid out as if he had been in the middle of a procedure. His body was never found. The only thing left behind was his white coat, draped over an empty operating table. Daniel exhaled slowly. The legend was real. Lisa shifted uncomfortably. "Do you understand now?" she whispered. "He's still here." Daniel's mind raced. Dr. Elias had disappeared, but he hadn't left. He was still practicing, still performing his horrific surgeries. And Daniel was his next patient. Daniel needed to see it. "The article said they found his old operating room," he said. "Where?" Lisa hesitated. Then, in a hushed voice, "The basement." Daniel's stomach turned. Of course it was the basement. Lisa shook her head. "I am not taking you down there." "I'll go alone," Daniel said. She groaned, running a hand through her hair. "You're impossible." Still, after a moment, she muttered, "If we get caught, I'm blaming you." And with that, she pushed his wheelchair toward the elevator, toward the darkness beneath St. Dismas Hospital. The elevator ride down to the basement was agonizingly slow. Lisa fidgeted beside Daniel, glancing at the glowing floor numbers as they descended. "If anyone catches us down here, I'm losing my job." Daniel barely heard her. His focus was on the cold weight of dread pressing down on him. The closer they got, the more wrong everything felt. Finally, with a dull ding, the doors slid open. The air was immediately colder, carrying the scent of mildew and something metallic. Blood? The hallway ahead stretched into darkness, only faintly illuminated by a few flickering overhead lights. Lisa hesitated. "We shouldn't be here." Daniel clenched his jaw. "I have to see it." With a reluctant sigh, Lisa pushed his wheelchair forward. Their footsteps echoed eerily down the hall as they passed rusted gurneys, forgotten medical carts, and shattered glass. The deeper they went, the stronger the sense of being watched grew. Then, they found it. At the very end of the hallway stood a heavy metal door, its surface scratched and rusted with age. A faded plaque above it read, "Surgical Room B13. Lisa's breath hitched. "This is it." Daniel's fingers tightened on the wheelchair's arms. Something about this door, it hummed with an unnatural presence. Lisa reached for the handle. Bang! They both jumped as a sharp noise echoed behind them. Spinning around, they saw nothing. The hallway was empty. Lisa swallowed hard. "I hate this place." Daniel took a deep breath. "Let's go." The door groaned as it swung open. The room beyond was frozen in time. A surgical table sat in the center, its surface covered in dried, rust-colored stains. Rotted cabinets lined the walls, filled with old medical tools, some still sharp, others corroded with age. Dim emergency lights cast an eerie glow over the room. But the worst part was, everything looked ready for surgery, as if Dr. Blackwood had never left. Lisa shuddered. "I can't be in here." Daniel, however, was transfixed. Slowly, he wheeled himself closer to the operating table. And then, the lights flickered. Lisa grabbed his shoulder. "We need to leave. Now." But Daniel wasn't listening, because the surgical table was no longer empty. A white coat, neatly folded, resting right in the center, and beside it, a single scalpel, gleaming under the dim lights. Daniel's heart pounded. A cold whisper slithered through the room. "You're awake for the procedure." Lisa screamed. The door slammed shut behind them. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the room. Lisa whirled around, yanking at the handle. "It's locked," she gasped, panic rising in her voice. Daniel barely registered her words. His gaze was frozen on the surgical table. The white coat, the gleaming scalpel, and the presence in the room. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the air, a whisper of something unseen. But then, the lights flickered violently, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that Daniel could see his own breath. Lisa clutched his arm. "Daniel!" The room lurched. The walls darkened, the surgical instruments on the counters rattled, and a deep, metallic groan echoed from the shadows. Then, from the far corner of the room, a figure emerged. Tall, gaunt, dressed in a pristine white doctor's coat, though its edges were stained with something dark. His face was partially obscured, the shadows clinging to his features like a mask, but the hollow, sunken eyes gleamed like polished steel. His fingers twitched, long and bony, stained with something red. And in his right hand, a scalpel. Lisa's breath came in sharp gasps. "Daniel, that's him." Dr. Elias Blackwood tilted his head, his gaze locking onto Daniel with an eerie, clinical detachment. Then, In a voice that was both distant and impossibly close, he spoke. "You're awake for the procedure." The words echoed inside Daniel's skull like a death sentence. Lisa screamed. The lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room. Daniel couldn't see, could barely breathe. Then, a harsh, blinding light snapped on above him. It wasn't coming from the ceiling. It was coming from a surgical lamp. He was lying on the operating table, his wrists and ankles strapped down. Lisa was gone. The scent of antiseptic and blood clogged his nostrils. The overhead lamp buzzed, its glow too sharp, too sterile. And then, just out of sight, the sound of metal instruments clinking together. A shadow loomed over him. Dr. Blackwood. His face was fully visible now, or what was left of it. His skin was gray and peeling, his mouth twisted into a grotesque, lipless grin. His eyes, cold silver, surgical instruments themselves, gleamed down at Daniel as he lifted a scalpel. Daniel's body wouldn't move. He tried to scream, but no sound came. Dr. Blackwood leaned closer, his breath icy against Daniel's skin. "I lost so many patients before you," the doctor whispered. "But you will be my masterpiece." The scalpel descended, searing pain. Daniel's world exploded in agony. He felt the blade cutting into his flesh. His vision blurred, the light above turning into a harsh, white void. And then, everything went black. Darkness. For a moment, Daniel thought he was dead. No pain, no sound, just the empty void. Then, air flooded his lungs. He gasped, his eyes snapping open. Cold. So cold. The ceiling above him wasn't the blinding surgical lamp anymore. It was metal. Clothes. Suffocating. Daniel tried to move, but his arms were pressed against his sides. Something was terribly wrong. His breath came fast and shallow as his fingers brushed against the walls around him. A confined space. Metallic. A drawer. A morgue drawer. Panic surged through him. Daniel thrashed, his shoulders slamming against the walls. "Help!" he choked out. His voice was muffled, swallowed by the thick silence of the morgue. No one was coming. He was in the hospital's morgue. Declared dead. But he was alive. A metallic creak echoed in the silence. Then, the sound of footsteps. Slow. Measured. Moving toward him. Daniel froze. The footsteps stopped right outside his drawer. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Sare-it. The drawer slid open. Blinding white light flooded his vision, forcing him to blink rapidly. His chest heaved, his body trembling from the freezing temperature. Then he saw Lisa. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. "Daniel." Daniel gasped, sucking in the cold air. "Lisa." His voice was raw. Weak. Lisa looked like she was about to faint. "Oh my God, they said you were dead." Daniel shuddered. So they really thought he was gone. But he wasn't. Lisa hurriedly grabbed his arm. "Come on. We need to get you out of here." Daniel stiffened. The air had shifted. The room had changed. Lisa must have felt it too because she froze. The light above them flickered. Then, a cold whisper slithered through the morgue. "You weren't supposed to wake up." Lisa's grip on Daniel tightened. And from the shadows of the morgue, Dr. Elias Blackwood stepped forward. Dr. Elias Blackwood stood at the far end of the morgue. The flickering overhead light cast his tall, gaunt figure into sharp relief. His white coat, once pristine, was now stained with something dark, the fabric clinging to his skeletal frame. His eyes, cold, metallic, unblinking, locked onto Daniel with a patient, clinical detachment. He wasn't in a hurry, because in his mind, his patient had nowhere to go. Lisa's breath hitched. "Daniel," she whispered. Daniel's pulse pounded. He was still weak, freezing, his body barely responding, but the sheer terror of Dr. Blackwood was enough to push him into motion. Lisa yanked him out of the morgue drawer. His limbs were stiff, his hospital gown offering no warmth, but adrenaline kicked in as he stumbled to his feet. Dr. Blackwood took a step forward. Lisa grabbed Daniel's arm. "Run." They bolted. The morgue doors slammed open as Lisa and Daniel ran out into the darkened hospital basement. The corridors stretched endlessly ahead, dim emergency lights casting eerie, flickering shadows. Lisa pulled him forward, her breathing ragged. Behind them, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps followed. Dr. Blackwood wasn't running. He didn't need to. He always caught his patients in the end. Daniel's breath came in short gasps, his legs barely keeping up. His head still spun from whatever hell he had just escaped from. Where are we going?" he panted. Lisa scanned the corridor frantically. "We need to get back to the main floors. If we can get to security." Bang! The lights exploded. plunging the hallway into darkness. Daniel froze. The air shifted. Lisa grabbed his wrist. "Don't stop." Hands wrapped around his ankle. Daniel screamed as something cold and skeletal clamped down on his leg, yanking him backward. Lisa's grip slipped as he was dragged into the darkness. Daniel hit the floor hard. His head slammed against the cold tile, sending his vision spinning. For a moment, he couldn't move. Then, he realized where he was. The operating room. But it wasn't like before. The room was wrong. The walls pulsed, dark and veined, like living flesh. The surgical tools on the counters gleamed wetly, the metal appearing almost organic. And the operating table. It was waiting for him. Straps unfastened. Leather restraints open. An invitation. Daniel tried to scramble backward, but a hand clamped onto his shoulder. Cold breath ghosted over his ear. "You're not leaving, Daniel." Dr. Blackwood stood behind him, and in his other hand, a gleaming, blood-stained scalpel. Lisa's scream echoed from somewhere beyond the walls. Daniel fought, but the doctor's grip was iron, unshakable. Dr. Blackwood shoved him toward the table, toward the final procedure. Daniel thrashed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His fingers clawed at the slick, pulsing floor, but it gave under his touch like raw muscle, offering no grip. "No, let me go," he choked out. Dr. Blackwood's fingers dug deeper into his shoulder, forcing him forward. The operating table loomed, the restraints coiling like hungry snakes, eager to snap shut the moment he was within reach. Lisa's scream came again, sharper this time, laced with agony. Daniel's mind raced. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't end up like the others. His free hand shot to his belt, fingers brushing over the cool, reassuring weight of the scalpel he'd swiped earlier. In one swift motion, he wrenched it free and drove it backward, aiming for the doctor's arm. A wet, sickening slice. Dr. Blackwood hissed, his grip loosening for the briefest moment. Daniel didn't hesitate. He spun, swinging wildly. The scalpel caught the doctor's cheek, carving a deep red gash. Blackwood recoiled, but his eyes, those cold, pitiless eyes, burned with something far worse than pain. Amusement. "You think you can fight this?" he murmured, touching the wound with gloved fingers. "Daniel, you were always meant for the table." The walls pulsed harder, a rhythmic, grotesque heartbeat. The room itself was alive, and it wanted him. A deep groan rattled the ceiling. The lights flickered, casting long, writhing shadows. The surgical tools on the counter trembled, then lifted, hovering, turning in midair to face him, their sharp edges glinting hungrily. Daniel's pulse pounded. He had to move. Now. He bolted for the door. The walls shuddered as if enraged. The floor beneath him heaved, nearly sending him sprawling. From behind, Dr. Blackwood's laughter followed, rich with certainty. "You can't run from what you are, Daniel." The door was just ahead, only a few steps more. Then something slammed into his back. A force, unseen but suffocating, wrapped around him, dragging him toward the table. The restraints snapped open, ready to claim him. Daniel screamed. Lisa's voice, faint now, whispered his name. Then, darkness swallowed him whole.